This is an oral history on January the 15th, 2016 with Lillian Shriro. The interviewer is May Sebel. Good afternoon, Lillian. How are you?
Well, I'm just fine.
Good. We're very interested to hear about your family history. And the first thing I'd like for you to do is go as far back as you can, knowing about your grandparents and great-grandparents, where they came from, and how you ended up in Dallas.
Well, my paternal grandparents lived in Odessa, Russia. And they lived in Odessa during the time of the Tsars. They decided to immigrate to the United States after my father almost died in one of the pogroms in Odessa. Luckily, he was able to find a dead child who was wearing a cross, and he removed the cross from the child's neck and put it on his own. And he knew if he could reach a hospital in Odessa that the Cossacks would not kill him. So he fled to the hospital. And that night when he came home, his father decided this was time to leave Russia and come to the United States. Well, because my father and my uncle, my father Abe Ornish and his brother Louis Ornish had not served in the Russian army, the Russians would not allow them to leave with my grandfather and his daughters. So my grandfather had a plan. He was going to come to the United States and borrow the money and send it to Abe and Louis so that they could leave Russia illegally. And his plan worked. It didn't take him very long to secure the money once he arrived in Dallas. And he sent it to the two boys. And the two boys used the money to bribe guards who were guarding a frozen lake to allow them to escape. And the guards said, fine, you can do this, but we're going to fire over your heads. And not knowing if the guards would keep their side of the bargain, Abe and Louis ran across this frozen lake. And the guards, of course, did keep their end of the deal. And then the boys amazingly walked across Europe to Germany, where they were able to secure transportation and a boat to come to the United States. And they came to the United States through Galveston. Now, my maternal grandparents lived in Suwałki, Poland, which at that time was a very prominent Jewish center in Poland. It was on the border of Poland and Russia. My grandfather had studied to be a rabbi in Europe, but he had so many children that he could not afford to just be a rabbi. He had to have other skills, and he was able to acquire skills as a contractor. And again, because of anti-Semitism in Suwałki, he wanted a better life for his children. And so he fled Suwałki and came to the United States. Now, at that time, he had just my mother and another daughter and a son. And he took those three children, and he and his wife came through Galveston. And they were met by a number of his brothers and sisters who had already fled Europe. And they had established dry goods stores all over Texas. And he came to Dallas, and it was kind of interesting because my mother actually gave an oral history of what it was like when they first came to the United States. She was 6 years old, And at that time, they were not allowed to bring any of their possessions, their money and so forth, from Europe. So times were very bad for my grandfather when he first arrived. Well, fortunately, my grandmother's family had established several grocery stores. So my grandfather started his business career working in one of those grocery stores. Then as his children started coming along, he thought it was time for him to start his own business. And he started a small construction business. And within a short time, they were able to build a beautiful home in South Dallas. He was also a founder of one of the Orthodox shuls in South Dallas.
Which one was that?
It was a good asylum.
How did your parents meet?
They met at a dance in Dallas, and they began dating. And my mother was so impressed with my father because he was such a good dresser. And they were married in the Baker Hotel in Dallas.
What year?
Well, she was 25 when they married, so that would have been about 1925.
And so the business that your dad was in at that time was the dry goods?
No, but at that time, my father was a partner with his brother-in-law in a men's ready-to-wear store in downtown Dallas. And he decided that he wanted his own, and so he did establish a dry goods store later on in Deep Elm in Dallas.
What was the name of it?
It was a pawn shop. It was Abe's Pawn Shop. And his store was known as the Neiman Marcus of the pawnbrokers because he was probably one, if not the most successful of the pawnbrokers on that street. And growing up in the pawn shop was really quite educational because his customers came from all walks of life. He had not only those who were down on their luck, and there were blue-collar workers, but he also had some very wealthy customers. And it was interesting, he was part psychologist and part business owner. They came in, most of his customers came in with stories about why they needed money. And it was everything from infidelities to losing a job. So, it was interesting because some of his, one of his customers apparently was having an affair, and he didn't want his wife to find out about what he was doing, and so he came in to my father to buy some very expensive jewelry, and then later, and apparently he gave it to the woman, and his wife somehow found out he had not given it to the woman yet, and his wife saw it and she thought, oh, this is just beautiful, and so she wanted to know where he bought it. So he told her, and so she insisted on meeting my father, and of course my father said, oh yes, you are just a wonderful person. You must be a wonderful person because he spent so much time with me trying to find the most perfect gift for you.
Did you grow up in South Dallas?
Yes, I did.
Tell me about your life there. What was it like growing up?
Well, I grew up in South Dallas during World War II. And the people who grew up, the Jewish people who grew up in our neighborhood, were sheltered from the anti-Semitism that existed during World War II. And now that I think back on my life growing up, it was because almost every single one of my neighbors was Jewish. And it was interesting, the heads of the households had fled Europe just as my parents had. And while they were in Europe, they were limited as to their occupations. Well, when they came to the United States, there was still anti-Semitism in Dallas. They could not go to work for the big banks or the insurance companies. So they had to start their own businesses, or they had to go into the professions. So all of our neighbors were either very successful businessmen, or they were doctors, or they were lawyers, or they were dentists.
Tell me how your family observed the holidays and what that was like.
Well, we were members of Sheriff Israel. In fact, at the time of my father's death, my parents had been members of Sheriff Israel for 25 years. The Ornish family was quite large at that time. There were over 100 members of the Ornish family in Dallas when I was growing up. We always celebrated the big holidays like Passover at my grandfather's house. He had this huge home that would accommodate all 100 of the members of the Ornish family. It was, I would say for the Ornish family, it was a true immigrant story. When the boys first came to Dallas, and my grandfather for that matter, they were very poor, so they had to work very, very hard to provide for their families. And as a result, because there were no restrictions on what they could do for a living, they did extremely well. And it was interesting what happened to the second generation. My brother, first of all, my father was very limited to where he could go to school in Russia. So when he came to the United States, he could not go to school because by then he had to work. But education was very important to him. So there was no question when my brother and I were growing up that we would go to college. He didn't care where we went as long as we went. This poor immigrant produced a very successful orthodontist. My brother's one of the most successful orthodontists in Dallas. My Uncle Louis, his brother, had a similar thing. His son was one of the most successful dentists in town. And
Is that Edwin?
His Dr. Edwin Ornish. And his grandson is the famous cardiologist, Dr. Dean Ornish. And the same was true of the girls. We all went to college. I had, my degree is from the University of Texas. I have a degree in journalism. And Edwin's daughters also went to college, and they had careers. I had two careers. My first as assistant editor of a company publication for Southern Life, which at that time was one of the largest insurance companies in Dallas. My second career came after my children started driving. And for 20 years, I was director of human resources for a large corporation. So all the children of these two immigrants have fulfilled their parents' dream. They're an American success story.
Living in South Dallas with all your Jewish neighbors, tell me about their involvement, your family's involvement in the community and community organizations.
Well, first of all the boys went to Hebrew school. And there were only two girls that went to Hebrew school, me and another young lady went to Hebrew school. We were all members of Jewish youth groups growing up. There was not a BBG back then, but there were Jewish youth groups, and we all of our activities centered around the Jewish Community Center. Most of our neighbors went to Shereth Israel or to Fereth Israel. We were close enough to walk to Temple Emmanuel on South Boulevard. We were also close enough to go to Fereth Israel. We had to drive to Shereth Israel, but I would say the majority of our neighbors belonged to Shereth Israel. When we went for the holidays, I can remember the Ornish family had 2 complete rows in Shereth Israel. And we all managed to squeeze into the rows. And when the rabbi, and I remember it was Rabbi Gold, began his sermon, all of the teenagers left the sanctuary and we went to the park and we discussed our social plans.
Tell me about your children.
Well, my son is an A&M graduate, and he is an IT professional. He's a network engineer. He works on these very sophisticated Cisco networks for very large corporations like the Port Authority of New Jersey, the Bush Library, a lot of municipalities, ESPN. My daughter is an attorney. She is a partner in a law firm. Her specialty is corporate bankruptcy. She's very active in Jewish organizations, one being AIPAC.
And how about your involvement as an adult in Jewish organizations?
At this time, I am not. In the past, I was a volunteer at Jewish Family Service. I was also a member of the Council of Jewish Women. But primarily because of my careers, I did not participate in more Jewish organizations. I was very active in my community. We live in Richardson, and my husband and I served on the board of the Richardson Symphony for 25 years.
Tell me about the changes that you've seen in Dallas. You grew up here, you've lived here all your life, basically. What changes have you seen?
The expansion of the cultural opportunities here. Yes, we had a symphony orchestra. We had the opera. I used to attend the symphony with my mother. We had season tickets to the Dallas Opera. The Metropolitan Opera used to come here. It, of course, no longer tours here. But there has been a tremendous expansion. I think we're very blessed to have the Art Center in downtown Dallas. These wonderful buildings like the Meyerson, the Winspar. I see even in the community that I live in, Richardson, we started a women's guild so that people who live in Richardson participate in the symphony, and they also have a women's guild. And the Dallas Symphony helped us establish that.
Anything else you want to tell us? I know you're working on something special. Tell us about that.
At the current time, I'm writing a book. I've written the book, and I am in the final editing stages of the book. The title of my book is Tales of a Jewish American Princess. And what it does is it traces what happened to me through having been born as a Jewish American princess to being able to have two very successful careers. And my story is not too different from most of the Jewish women today. To give you an idea of what it was like, most of my neighbors and our Jewish friends had help. In fact, our stories are very much like those in the movie The Help. We had a maid who worked for our family for over 50 years. Not only did she raise me and my brother, but she also raised my two children. And then, even though I started out as a Jewish American princess, I was able to go to college and then have two careers. This was almost unheard of when I was growing up. Most of the Jewish women worked. Today, like my daughter, they're very successful career women. And so this book shows how I transitioned from an American princess to a career woman. And to give you an idea of how much of an American princess I was, when growing up, I did not know how to make a bed, I did not know how to cook, and I did not know how to do my own hair. And my mother decided when I was 13 years old that it would be good if I went to camp. So she sent me to Tres Rios, which was the Y camp, which is where a lot of the Jewish girls were going, because there were a lot of these really fine camps that our kids had today were not available to us back then. And so my first day at camp, now keep in mind, I did not know how to make a bed. I did not know how to take care of myself. So the first day went fine. The next morning we got up and the counselor said, well, these are our activities for the day. But the first thing you need to do is make your bed. And so in all innocence, I turned to the camp counselor and I said, make our own bed? What time do the maids come in? So anyway, my stay at the camp, needless to say, was not very successful. But anyway, and then when I went off to college, things began to change. And again, you see the transition of how I became, in the book, a career woman. And then it's followed by the transition of my daughter becoming a very successful attorney.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been excellent. We appreciate your taking the time to give us your oral history.
Thank you, May. Enjoyed it.